Hi class, welcome to Chapter 7, Transformations and Interactions with Metabolism. This chapter I'm going to cover a little bit briefly versus as extensively as we've covered some of the other chapters. If you want to read more about it, you can read more about it in your book or watch some online videos. I'm just covering it briefly because for purposes of this particular class, I feel that there are other things we can focus on that might be more applicable to your everyday food intakes and just diet in general. But metabolism is the foundation for understanding nutrition, and so if you move on to take advanced courses in nutrition, or if you take anatomy and physiology, you're going to be learning a lot more about metabolism. So, metabolism. Metabolism represents the sum of all the chemical reactions going on in a cell. And in general, there are two categories within metabolism. There is anabolism or anabolic reactions, which represent building, and there are catabolism or catabolic reactions, which represent breaking down. In anabolism, like I mentioned, we are building things. So this might be the building of proteins, the building of new bone, the building of red blood cells, the building of immune factors. In catabolism, we are breaking things down. So maybe we're breaking down fat cells to use as energy. And metabolism takes place in every single cell in the body, but some cells are more metabolically active than others, and specifically cells in the liver are the most metabolically active. This is a picture of a cell, and again, you don't have to memorize the cell components for this particular class, but some components I'll point out. You have something called the mitochondria, and it's actually within the mitochondria of the cell, which is right here, that multiple chemical reactions take place. And so we see a lot of metabolism happening within the mitochondria of the cell. Okay, so looking at some different types of chemical reactions, we have anabolic reactions, which I said were building reactions, and then we have catabolic reactions, which are breaking reactions. When you build something, think about any time you've ever built anything, it takes energy to build things. And we're going to learn that energy comes in the form of ATP. So anytime we're building something or performing an anabolic reaction, we're going to need energy in order to do so. So some examples of anabolic reactions are the formation of glycogen from glucose molecules, the formation of triglycerides from glycerol and fatty acids, and the formation of proteins from amino acids. Catabolism or catabolic reactions are the opposite of anabolic reactions. So in catabolic reactions, we're breaking things down. And so glycogen is our storage form of glucose for energy, and we store glycogen in our muscles and our liver. And when we need more glucose, we can break down glycogen to get it. When we break things down, it actually gives us energy. So as we break down glycogen to glucose, it yields energy, which is going to come in the form of something called ATP. Similarly, we can break down triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids, also yielding energy, and we can take apart proteins into their individual amino acids, also yielding energy. So what is this ATP that I talk about? ATP is the body's currency for energy, and it stands for adenosine triphosphate. It has different chemical groups within its structure, so it has a purine and adenine group, a sugar, which is considered a ribose group, and 3 phosphate groups. And you can see the 3 phosphate groups kind of on the right-hand side of the screen. And each of these 3 phosphate groups has negative charges. And so what can happen with these phosphate groups is they're actually susceptible to hydrolysis. So if you remember, in a hydrolysis reaction, we're going to add water and we're going to be splitting apart a molecule. So in hydrolysis, we can add water across these different bonds and split off the phosphate groups to yield energy. So in that way, we can get energy from ATP. Now I'm going to attempt to clear this and attempt to get rid of it. All right. So enzymes. We talked a little bit about enzymes in my protein lecture, and remember that enzymes are proteins that facilitate chemical reactions. Well, enzymes are important, but enzymes often need a little bit of assistance or help. And so many enzymes actually require the presence of a coenzyme. And a coenzyme is kind of like an enzyme assistant or an enzyme helper. Without the presence of a coenzyme, enzymes have difficulty functioning and may not function at all. And it just so happens that in metabolic reactions, many of the coenzymes are actually the B vitamins. So in this particular diagram, you can see homocysteine, methionine, metabolism, cysteine metabolism, and you see that folate is playing a role. Vitamin B6 and vitamin B12 are all playing roles as coenzymes, allowing those metabolic pathways to take place. So if somebody had B vitamin deficiencies, it would be possible that their ability to metabolize or break down or make different products would be hugely impaired, and therefore it would also be very possible that they would have reduced capacity to produce enzyme or produce energy from these energy yielding metabolic reactions. So the B vitamins are very crucial to all of the metabolic processes. The liver. I already mentioned that metabolism happens in every cell of the body, but the liver happens to be the most kind of metabolically active cell. And so when we eat foods, the liver is one of the first places that receives the nutrients from the foods. The liver then metabolizes these nutrients, it packages these nutrients for later use, it stores these nutrients, or it ships them out so that other tissues can use them. The liver is also involved in detoxification and breaks down drugs as well as alcohol. And when the liver is playing a role in detoxification, its role in metabolic reactions, energy production, carb, fat, and protein metabolism is downregulated. So its role in detoxification, alcohol, drug breakdown takes precedence over its role in metabolic processes. Energy yielding pathways. So this is a very, very simplified picture of energy yielding pathways and metabolism. And we're starting off with this picture of a cheeseburger. The reason the cheeseburger is selected because it has protein from the meat and the cheese, it has carbohydrate from the bun, and it has fat from likely the meat and the cheese. So it has all of the three macronutrients, and we can trace how they move through the body in metabolic processes. So let's start at the left with protein. We know from the past lecture that protein can be broken down to amino acids. Amino acids can then be converted into a 3-carbon compound called pyruvate, and pyruvate can be converted into a 2-carbon compound called acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA, you may notice, has multiple arrows pointing to it, and actually protein, carb, and fats can all be broken down into acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon compound that can enter something called the TCA, or tricarboxylic acid cycle. Going back to proteins, we said that they can be broken down to pyruvate and acetyl-CoA. They can also, depending on the type of protein, enter the TCA cycle immediately without being previously broken down to pyruvate or acetyl-CoA. So proteins have 3 kind of opportunities to enter these metabolic pathways. Carbohydrates we break down to glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. For every 6 carbons in glucose, we can get 2 pyruvate molecules because pyruvate is a 3-carbon compound. And then from pyruvate, we can get 2 acetyl-CoAs. The additional carbon is lost and combines with oxygen. Acetyl-CoA then will enter the TCA cycle and move through the metabolic process. And then when we break down fat, remember we'll separate the glycerol backbone from the 3 fatty acids, since most of the fats we consume in our body are in the form of triglycerides. Glycerol can be converted into pyruvate, and fatty acids can be converted into acetyl-CoA. So once all these compounds are converted into acetyl-CoA, or in the case of protein, enter the TCA cycle, the TCA cycle, or tricarboxylic acid cycle, is otherwise known as the Krebs cycle. And this is a cycle where 2-carbon compound acetyl-CoA will combine with a 4-carbon compound called oxaloacetate, and through this TCA cycle, we'll have multiple exchanges of carbons, and this will generate electrons. Those electrons can move through the electron transport chain, and the electron transport chain uses hydrogen to generate energy. So it uses hydrogen and electrons to generate energy, which energy is produced in the form of ATP. A byproduct of energy metabolism is the production of water when these hydrogen ions that move through the electron transport chain combine with oxygen. So in that manner, you can see that this particular pathway requires oxygen, since the end product is water and hydrogen ions are combining with oxygen to form H2O. Without the presence of oxygen, we can only do a partial energy metabolism, and so under anabolic conditions, which are considered to have no oxygen, we cannot generate as much energy, or ATP, compared to what we're able to generate under aerobic conditions, which means in the presence of oxygen. All right, so this is a similar table kind of going off that previous picture, and it's looking at the macronutrients and their pathways through metabolism. So if you note, we have carbs, we have lipids, which are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, and we have proteins. All of the compounds can yield energy. And so energy, remember, is ATP. So we can make energy from carbs, lipids, fatty acids, glycerol, and amino acids. Carbohydrates, we know, can be used to make glucose. Carbohydrates can also be used to make some proteins if nitrogen is available. And when we eat too many carbohydrates, we can turn the excess into fat. Fatty acids can make energy, like I just said. However, fatty acids cannot make glucose. So this is something important to remember, and something that differentiates the fatty acids from the other kind of macronutrient breakdown products, is that fatty acids cannot make glucose. Fatty acids also cannot be used to make protein. So you cannot make glucose or protein from the fatty acid portion of the triglyceride. However, fatty acids can be used to make fat. The glycerol component of the triglyceride is different than the fatty acid component in that it can make energy, it can make glucose, and it can make proteins if nitrogen is available, and it also makes fat. And then proteins are more similar to carbohydrates in their metabolic processes, because proteins can make energy, they can make glucose. We have glucogenic amino acids that can be used to make glucose when carbs aren't available. They can make proteins, and they can be used as fat. So try to clear this and then get rid of, oops, sorry. Okay. So What happens under these different processes of feasting and fasting? And when I say feasting and fasting, I really mean what happens when we eat versus when we're not eating. So after we eat a meal, let's just say this is a mixed meal, somewhat like our cheeseburger that contains carbs, fats, and protein. The carbs can be converted to glucose or broken down into glucose. The fat is going to be separated into fatty acids and glycerol, and the protein is going to be broken down into amino acids. The glucose from the carbohydrate will be stored in the liver and muscle as glycogen, and if our glycogen stores are met, then we will convert any additional glucose into fat. Fatty acids can be directly stored as fat. And then proteins can be used for anabolic reactions where we're building protein, or if there's excess protein, we can store protein as fat, as well as we will deaminate amino acids and lose nitrogen via metabolism in the liver and then excretion by the kidneys. So that's what happens when we eat. When we have not eaten for a few hours, so say you had breakfast at 7 a.m. and now it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, our body starts to do slightly different things. So our body has now used up all of our breakfast. It's eaten, it's oatmeal and cereal and milk and fruit, and it's used up kind of all those nutrients. So it starts looking other places for nutrients. And luckily, our body is able to store nutrients that can be used as energy for times when we're not eating. So one of our main stores of one of these energy components is glycogen, which again is stored in the liver and muscle. So when we haven't eaten for a while, our body will tap into our glycogen stores and it will break glycogen down into glucose. And so the cells can use glucose for energy. If we have used up all our glycogen, or as we use up our glycogen, our body may also tap into our fat stores. We have almost nearly endless supplies of fat stores, but enough fat to last us months and months, where glycogen may only last a few hours. And so fat can be broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, which can also be used for energy. If we still haven't eaten, say 24 hours or more later, and we continue to fast or restrict food, our body will have used up all the glycogen pictured in part B, and we will no longer have glycogen available as an energy source. And so we will continue to tap into our body fat stores, and as we do this, we're actually going to start to break down a little bit of protein. As we break down protein, it can form amino acids, and we do have amino acids that are considered glucogenic, and so certain amino acids can be used to make glucose. And glucose is our preferred form of energy used by the cells, specifically the brain, the nervous system, and the red blood cells, so we'll be able to provide glucose to those cells. In addition to glucose production, we're going to have the production of ketone bodies. And ketone bodies can occur due to amino acid metabolism, but primarily occur due to fatty acid metabolism. Ketone bodies can also be used for energy by the cells. However, it takes our body a bit of time to adjust to using ketone bodies. So initially, our body is not very efficient at using ketone bodies, but eventually it can adjust to use ketone bodies. And this allows us to survive in times where there was very limited access to food. We could break down our fat and produce ketone bodies that some of our cells could use for fuel. So looking a little bit closer at these ketone bodies. Ketone bodies will be produced when you're fasting. These could also be produced on very low carb diets, and I'm talking like 10% of calories or less coming from carbohydrates. So maybe you're only consuming like 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrates a day. Ketone bodies are also formed in uncontrolled diabetes, usually type 1, but it can happen in type 2, because in type 1 diabetes, blood sugar levels rise. However, the cells aren't able to use the blood sugar or the glucose, And so the cells need an alternate fuel. And so what the body will do is start breaking down fat to produce ketone bodies, ketone bodies don't require insulin to get into the cells. And so sometimes we see this in diabetes type 1, and it can actually be fatal in type 1 diabetes. Something called diabetic ketoacidosis can develop. So ketone bodies, there are 3 different types of ketone bodies, and the word ketone refers to this carbon with the double bond oxygen on it. And so that is kind of a ketone. And so we have acetoacetate, we have acetone, and we have D-beta hydroxybutyrate. These are 3 types of ketone bodies that are formed. And our cells can use them as fuel, so they help us survive during times of starvation. Like I said before, the brain does prefer glucose, but it can adapt to use ketones, and ketones can cross the blood-brain barrier. Like I mentioned, ketones don't require insulin to enter the cell, and so they can be a beneficial source of energy in that sense. What else would I say about this? The longer that somebody undergoes a fast or a super carb-restricted diet, the higher the ketone bodies will climb up into a certain point. In diabetic patients, the ketone bodies can climb uncontrollably and can cause serious side effects, like I mentioned, coma and death. In non-diabetic patients, we don't usually see the ketone bodies posing quite that level of a threat, but you do sometimes have some adverse side effects. And so I feel that I can't talk about ketones without addressing the elephant in the room, which is ketogenic diets. And ketogenic diets have actually been around for quite some time, but have recently become pretty popular with mainstream media, dieting fads, health blogs, etc. And so what a ketogenic is, medically speaking, is a true ketogenic diet has about 90% of calories coming from fat and only about 5% of calories coming from carbohydrates and protein. That is a true medically clinical ketogenic diet. And that true medical clinical ketogenic diet has actually been used to treat epilepsy in children. So epilepsy is a form of seizures where children have recurrent seizures. And in some children where medication hasn't been effective, they can try this ketogenic diet and have reduction in their seizures. What's been more popularized by the media is kind of this fad ketogenic diet. And what I've seen with the fad ketogenic diet is the carb and protein intakes tend to be higher than the clinical ketogenic diet. And so also the fat intakes tend to be lower. So this kind of fad ketogenic diet tends to be about 70% calories coming from fat and the other 30% coming from protein and carbohydrates. Some fad ketogenic diets are high in protein, but still low in carbohydrates. But the thing with protein is we can actually produce glucose from proteins. And so you won't enter into as deep of a ketosis if you are practicing a ketogenic diet that is also really high in proteins. There are possible risks of ketogenic diet since it is very high in fat. However, it's possible to be on a ketogenic diet that has a better proportion of healthy fats versus unhealthy fats. There are also risks of a ketogenic diet, such as nutrient deficiencies due to lack of dietary diversity. You could imagine that if you're eating 90% of your calories from fats, there may be certain food groups that you're excluding or restricting or severely limiting, where you could be getting lots of vitamins and minerals from those food groups had you been including them. Long-term use of ketogenic diet, we're not 100% sure of. Right now, we only have a few studies out that have been a couple years long, and generally they seem to be safe. However, some studies have shown increased levels of LDL cholesterol, which remember is our quote-unquote bad cholesterol. However, we're not necessarily sure that these high levels of LDL caused by the ketogenic diet are associated with adverse health outcomes like heart disease or stroke. We do sometimes see positive weight loss with ketogenic diet, which can be great if you're trying to lose weight. It can be not great if you are a diabetic type 1 patient and you're burning through your fat stores uncontrollably. When people initiate a ketogenic diet, a lot of people tend to get what's called a keto flu, where they may feel sluggish, tired, low energy, fatigued, nauseous, achy, and just overall not good. And this is where their body is adapting to using ketones as a fuel source, where previously their body was used to relying on carbohydrates and usually a higher carb diet. Other things that can happen, constipation, because high-fat foods tend to be low in fiber, especially if you're following a strict ketogenic diet. Low blood pressure may happen, elevated uric acid, especially if you're eating high-fat, high-protein foods. You may have a foul taste in your mouth. You may also have a sweet-smelling breath. So one of the ketones, acetone, actually is fruity smelling. And so you may have fruity smelling breath, which maybe wouldn't necessarily be that bad. Pregnant women should not follow a ketogenic diet because it's possible that it would be limiting glucose availability to the baby, and babies primarily use glucose for energy and growth. And then I mentioned weight loss. So right now, I do think that there are some potential good benefits of a ketogenic diet. I also think that more research needs to be done to study the long-term effects, but I definitely feel that there are some potentially good benefits of a ketogenic diet. So, obviously, when initiating any sort of diet, you should talk to your doctor or dietitian and make sure that this diet is safe for you. So, all right, next, alcohol. So alcohol is not a nutrient, even though we can get calories from it and we can produce energy from it. It's not considered a nutrient, it's considered a toxin. And so there are a couple types of alcohol. An alcohol is actually just a chemical name where you see an OH group. So if you have an OH group or an oxygen and hydrogen on a chemical structure, that structure might be considered an alcohol. So here we have a picture of glycerol, which hopefully you remember glycerol formed the glycerol backbone in triglycerides. And then in the blue, we have a picture of ethanol. And ethanol only has one OH group, and ethanol is the type of alcohol that comes from liquor, beer, wine, spirits, etc. So the type that we usually consider typical alcohol, thus drinking. Alcohol in the body. So when we drink alcohol, it is first metabolized by the stomach. And people metabolize alcohol to different extents depending on their gender, their production of a certain enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, even their ethnicity. Certain ethnicities metabolize alcohol faster or more slowly than other ethnicities. So alcohol is first metabolized in the stomach, and it's quickly absorbed across the walls of the stomach. If you drink alcohol on an empty stomach, this is going to happen a lot quicker. If you're eating a lot of food at the same time as drinking alcohol, the passing of alcohol through the walls of the stomach could be a little bit slower. So food intake, slow alcohol absorption. Alcohol is broken down by an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, and alcohol dehydrogenase is present in the stomach as well as the liver. And so alcohol dehydrogenase is needed for the first step in alcohol breakdown, which is the conversion of ethanol to a compound called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is less toxic than ethanol, and acetaldehyde can be further broken down to acetate, which is not considered toxic to our bodies. Women produce less of the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, so when women drink, there continues to be a higher level of ethanol in their bloodstream compared to the less toxic compounds, acetaldehyde or acetate. And so this is the reason that women may seem to exhibit the effects of intoxication more quickly than men do. After going through the stomach, alcohol can be absorbed through the intestinal cells and is brought to the liver. And in the liver, we also have this alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, and that can break down ethanol to acetaldehyde. There are additional enzymes that are involved in ethanol breakdown as well, but alcohol dehydrogenase is the primary enzyme involved. And then after alcohol has been converted to acetaldehyde, it can be converted to acetate by acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. The liver is pretty effective at breaking down alcohol. However, when alcohol reaches the liver will prioritize alcohol breakdown versus any other of its metabolic processes that were taking place at that time. So, for example, if the liver was busy making glycogen, or if the liver was busy converting glucose to ATP or making energy, the liver will kind of stop what it's doing and prioritize that alcohol breakdown because the alcohol is so toxic. So it's possible for people to develop liver disease, people to develop high triglycerides, many adverse consequences related to the entire body, but also liver damage due to this alcohol metabolism. This is just another diagram showing the same thing. Ethanol being converted to acetaldehyde, being converted to acetate. Acetate can then be converted to acetyl-CoA, which hopefully you remember acetyl-CoA was a 2-carbon compound and can enter the Krebs cycle or the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the TCA cycle, and produce energy. So we do get calories from alcohol, and we actually get 7 calories per gram alcohol. So with carbs and proteins, we get 4 calories per gram. With fat, we get 9 calories per gram. And with alcohol, we get 7 calories per gram. Health effects of alcohol. So alcohol can negatively affect the entire body. It can affect the brain. It can decrease neurotransmitter synthesis and function. It can decrease action potentials. It is considered a neurotoxin. Alcohol can cause malnutrition from multiple standpoints. For one, it will interrupt the liver's metabolism of nutrients, and so it can inhibit absorption of multiple nutrients. It can also damage the intestinal cell walls. If people are consuming alcohol, they may be consuming limited quantities of other healthy foods, which can contribute to malnutrition. Alcohol can cause fatty liver disease, fibrosis, cirrhosis, which is scarring of the liver, and eventually cirrhosis can lead to liver failure and death. Alcohol interrupts the B vitamin metabolism, so specifically folate, thiamine, B6 metabolism is affected by alcohol. And because all those B vitamins were cofactors in metabolism, if their metabolism and absorption is interrupted, they can no longer play a role in metabolism. So many, many effects, as well as some of the ones shown on this diagram. All right, so that is the quick chapter 7. Again, if you want to learn more about metabolism, feel free to read extensively in your book or watch some videos on YouTube. I decided not to focus extensively on it for this class, but if you are going to pursue a degree in nutrition or other kind of medical careers, you will probably learn a lot more about metabolism, so you may want to read up on that. All right, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye.